What happens when belonging costs you your authenticity? What if somewhere along the way you learned that being loved meant being agreeable, that being accepted meant staying quiet, that being loyal meant not talking about what hurt you? Sometimes we don't lose ourselves all at once. We lose ourselves one adaptation at a time. We learn what we can say, what we shouldn't say, which emotions make people uncomfortable, which parts of ourselves earn connection, and which parts threaten it. And eventually, belonging can become more important than authenticity. But here's where grief enters the conversation. What happens when you finally realize how much of yourself you gave up just to remain connected to other people or to your adaptation? Today, we're talking about that grief and about something that can be incredibly difficult to hold. The truth is, two things can be true. Someone can love you and hurt you. Someone can have their own trauma and still affect yours. You can understand why someone behaved the way that they did and still grieve what their behavior cost you. Acknowledging your experience isn't betrayal, and understanding theirs doesn't require abandoning your own. Stay tuned for this episode.
Before we begin, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This isn't a podcast about quick fixes, positive thinking, or pretending the past didn't happen. These conversations are designed to challenge the way you understand yourself, your relationships, your nervous system, and the survival strategies that shaped your life. The goal of this podcast is to translate trauma into language that makes sense, so you can better understand your experiences, recognize your patterns, and explore yourself with greater clarity and compassion. This podcast is intended for educational and personal growth purposes. It is not a substitute for therapy, mental health treatment, medical care, or crisis support. If you find yourself becoming emotionally overwhelmed, please consider pausing the episode, practicing self-care, and reaching out to a qualified mental health professional for additional support. Healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about understanding who survival required you to become, and discovering who you are underneath the armor. If you're ready to have honest conversations, ask difficult questions, and explore what it truly means to heal, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This is where survival ends, and choices begin.
Hi, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. I am Alicia Lynch.
I'm Cody. Hi.
This is part 2 of our grieving episode of The War Within, and there is a ton of stuff to get into, so let's just dive right into it.
Why does seeing other people have supportive families sometimes hurt so much?
Because you're not necessarily resentful that they have it. Sometimes seeing it reveals what you wanted. You can genuinely be happy for someone and simultaneously feel grief for yourself.
Is it jealousy, or am I grieving something I never received?
Sometimes it's both. Instead of immediately shaming yourself for jealousy, ask, what does this person's experience represent to me? Maybe it's protection, belonging, financial security, parental support, or being chosen. Jealousy can sometimes point toward a loss.
Why does being left out hurt more when you felt unwanted before?
Because the present experience can connect with your older experiences. You're not necessarily responding only to today's invitation. Today's exclusion may activate years of, I'm not chosen.
What is loss of authenticity?
It's what can happen when safety depends on adapting yourself around everyone else. You become what people needed: easy, successful, quiet, funny, strong, helpful. You lose contact with what you actually feel, need, believe, and want. So, one of the quieter things that a person can grieve is how they've lived as a version of themselves that was designed for survival rather than expression. Authenticity develops when there's enough safety to discover this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is what I want, this is what I feel, this matters to me, this hurts me, this is what I believe, this is where my boundary is. And importantly, I can reveal these things and remain connected to other people.
How can survival cause, you to become who everyone else needed?
Because adaptation can protect connection. If one version of me received love and another creates conflict, I'm going to learn which version is safer to show. So maybe anger was punishment, crying was mocked, saying no caused conflict. Having needs made you difficult, so then you decided not to have any. Disagreeing was disrespectful. I don't know about the younger generation, but I know a lot of us in the 50s, majority of us, you remember hearing, I'm the parent, you're the child. Will you hear that? I don't think that the parent necessarily meant anything malicious by stating this. And it is true. However, you hear it over and over and over again. Like for myself, I stopped asking questions because I'm the child. So you don't disagree with, I make the rules, I pay the bills. So you don't disagree. You're right. Okay. And then you shrink there and you don't even realize that. And you can carry that into your adult life. Success threatened someone, maybe. Maybe failure brought someone shame. Maybe talking about what happened wasn't allowed. Maybe being different resulted in rejection. And then authenticity developed at a cost. Human beings, especially children, will often choose attachment over authenticity. So when they believe they cannot have both, the lesson becomes, if being myself threatens belonging, I will change myself before I risk losing belonging. So authenticity can slowly turn into performance. This doesn't necessarily look like someone consciously pretending to be another person. It's often much more subtle. You laugh when you're uncomfortable. You say you're fine when you're not. You agree when you disagree. You apologize before expressing an opinion. You say yes when your entire body says no. You minimize accomplishments so someone else won't feel threatened. You hide sadness because you don't want to be a burden. You suppress anger because conflict feels dangerous. You pretend not to care when you do care enormously. You become whatever version of yourself seems safest. Eventually, you can become exceptionally good at adapting and increasingly unfamiliar with yourself. And that's where this connects beautifully with your adaptive self. I thought this was my personality. This is where healing can become destabilizing. Someone begins examining themselves and asks how much of what I called my personality is actually adaptation. Am I naturally easygoing? Or did I learn not to have preferences? Am I independent? Or did I learn nobody was coming? Am I private? Or did vulnerability repeatedly hurt me? Am I a perfectionist? Or did mistakes once threaten connection or safety? Am I the caregiver because nurturing people fulfills me? Or is it because being needed makes me feel I might be harder to abandon? Am I agreeable or am I terrified of conflict? Am I low maintenance or did I learn that having needs makes people leave? Am I strong or have I simply felt permitted to fall apart? Here's the complicated part. Sometimes the answer is both. Trauma doesn't create a completely fake human being. Our personalities, our temperaments, experiences, relationships, biology, choices, culture, and adaptations all become intertwined. So, healing isn't an archaeological expedition where eventually we uncover the real person who existed before everything happened. It's more nuanced. We're learning which parts of me feel chosen, which parts of me feel compulsory. Authenticity isn't doing whatever I want. Um, Authenticity isn't just who I am, deal with it. It isn't refusing accountability. It isn't saying every thought out loud. It isn't never compromising. It isn't ignoring how our behavior affects other people. Authenticity is congruence. When the person that you present to the world isn't chronically disconnected from your internal experience, I can compromise without abandoning myself. I can consider your feelings without pretending mine don't exist. I can adapt to different situations without becoming a completely different person in every room. I can love you without disappearing inside the relationship.
What happens when healing makes you realize you don't know who you are?
Oh, that's deep.
I know, such a good person.
This can be terrifying. But it can also mean that you're finally separating identity from adaptation. The answer doesn't have to appear immediately. Identity can be discovered through choices, values, preferences, boundaries, and experience. But then comes the grief. Once someone begins becoming more authentic, they may look backwards and realize I spent years being who everyone needed me to be. That's grief. They may grieve all the times that they didn't speak, all the boundaries they didn't establish, all the things they pretended not to want, all the interests they hid, all the relationships in which they were loved but aren't sure whether they themselves were actually known. And that last one's brutal because someone can realize they loved the version of me that never challenged them, or they knew what I did for them. They didn't actually know me. This can create an uncomfortable question. If somebody only accepts me when I'm performing the version of myself they prefer, is that belonging or is that compliance? Becoming authentic can actually create more loss at first. When someone stops performing, relationships sometimes change. We discussed that in one of our episodes previous. The person who always says yes starts saying no. The fixer stops fixing. The caretaker asks for reciprocity. The quiet one starts speaking. The person who tolerated disrespect established boundaries. The person who hid their needs begins expressing them. And people accustomed to the adaptation version, the adaptive version, may say that you've changed. Sometimes they're right. You have changed. The question is whether you've become someone else or whether you finally stopped abandoning yourself to remain acceptable. And sometimes becoming authentic costs relationships. And that's another layer of consequential grief. Your first loss, authenticity, to preserve belonging. And then years later, reclaiming authenticity may threaten the very belonging that you sacrificed yourself to maintain in the first place. So let's look at the cycle. Loss of connection, loss of belonging, loss of authenticity, loss of identity, loss of self-trust, loss of confidence, loss of opportunities, grief for the unlived life/future. Sometimes we don't realize how much we've lost until we become safe enough to recognize what was missing. Healing can therefore contain an incredibly strange contradiction. You're finally finding yourself and grieving yourself at the same time.
Can a coping mechanism create additional losses?
Absolutely. Something can help you survive one period and eventually create consequences. Relationships, health, money, opportunities, time. That's another example of consequential grief. When the coping mechanism became the companion, we often talk about coping mechanisms from like the outside. So stop drinking, stop overeating, stop scrolling, stop shopping, stop overworking, stop people pleasing, stop escaping. And sometimes stopping or changing the behavior is absolutely necessary. But there's another question. What did that behavior do for the person? Because behaviors don't usually persist for years for absolutely no reason. For someone living with complex trauma, a coping mechanism may have become more than a habit. It may have become a comfortable, comfort, predictability, escape, regulation, numbness, reward, control, companionship, something dependable in an undependable world. And if we only attack the behavior without understanding its function, we can miss why giving it up feels so frightening. If it was there when nobody else was, that's the emotional part of this. So imagine being lonely. Nobody calls, nobody notices, nobody asks what's wrong. But food's there, alcohol's there, the phone's there, work is there, gaming is there, shopping is there, achievement is there. Whatever the strategy is, it responds predictably. People may reject you, the behavior doesn't. People may misunderstand you, the behavior doesn't. It doesn't ask you to explain yourself. People may become annoyed with your emotions. The behavior doesn't tell you that you're too much. People may leave. The coping mechanism stays available. Of course, someone can become attached to that. Not necessarily because they love the behavior itself. They maybe become attached to what happens inside of them when they engage in it. Relief, even temporary relief, can become incredibly important when someone lives with chronic distress. When people are unpredictable, things can feel safer. Everything that we've been discussing about belonging, human relationships require vulnerability. So if I need you, you might say no. If I tell you how I feel, you might judge me. If I love you, you might leave. If I depend on you, you might disappoint me. But a coping strategy can feel far more predictable. Food doesn't suddenly decide it doesn't love you. Work doesn't tell your relatives that you're selfish. Shopping doesn't say your needs are too much. Gaming doesn't criticize you for crying.
Depends on the game and the players. Like if you play COD, like Call of Duty, and you mess up, oh yeah, those multiplayer people are assholes.
Lovely.
They will. I've been in those type of game online, on multiplayer games. Some of those people get too intense, and I've heard people cry.
Okay, well, that's dedication.
That is, but it'll be the little 13, 14-year-old heathens who cuss the other grown adults out. Fucking little assholes.
Okay, that's great.
Excuse my language.
I don't play games, so I don't
get back
I don't know.
to what you were saying.
All right, well, social media doesn't necessarily require emotional intimacy. Achievement gives you a measurable answer. So I accomplished something. Perfectionism gives you a rule. If I do everything correctly, maybe I'll be safe. People pleasing gives you a strategy. If everyone's happy with me, maybe they won't leave. Different behaviors, but underneath them may be a similar pursuit. Give me something I can control. And some coping mechanisms provide emotional experiences that relationships didn't. So food can become comfort. It's not simply a nutrition. Food can be a sensory thing. It's warm, it's pleasurable, it's predictable. Available if comfort from people was inconsistent. So like eating may become associated with soothing. And then telling someone just stop emotional eating misses the question. What are they supposed to do with the emotion that eating's been helping them regulate?
Cry.
Alcohol or drugs can become quiet. In my experience, no, but maybe at the beginning. Um, for some people, substances temporarily alter unbearable internal states. Anxiety quiets, shame quiets, memories quiet, hyperarousal quiets, loneliness quiets. It feels different. And that's one reason that substance use can become so difficult to leave behind. This isn't an endorsement of substance use or a claim that it actually resolves the underlying problem. Keep that in mind. Um, because it doesn't. It's recognition of the function it may have been serving. So, like, recovery then requires more than removing the substance. The person may need entirely new ways of handling what the substance has been helping them escape or tolerate. Work can become safety. So work is socially rewarded, which makes this, easy to miss and people not notice. So at work, there are rules, there's tasks, there's deadlines, there's measurable productivity, there may be praise, there may be, competence. Home and relationships can feel ambiguous. Work says do this and you succeed. Relationships aren't that predictable. So someone can spend enormous amounts of time working and believe I'm ambitious. And maybe that's true. But perhaps work is also where they feel the safest. And if healing asks them to slow down, what happens when there's nothing left to accomplish? That's when the feeling work has been keeping quiet may return. Achievement. This can become a substitute for worth. This one's particularly important. So if someone didn't feel valued simply for existing, achievement can become a way to manufacture value. If I accomplish enough, I'll matter. If I'm successful enough, they'll respect me. If I prove everyone wrong, I'll finally feel okay. And achievement works. Briefly, you get an award, a promotion, a degree, a business, money, recognition. For a moment, you can think, see, I matter. And then the feeling fades. So then another accomplishment is needed because achievement was being asked to solve a problem it cannot permanently solve: human worth. That's why someone can become extremely accomplished and still feel fundamentally inadequate. Perfectionism can become protection. People think perfectionists simply want everything perfect. Often it's more complicated. Perfectionism can contain, if I don't make mistakes, nobody can criticize me. If I do everything right, nobody will be disappointed. If I'm exceptional, nobody can reject me. That's not simply ambition. That's an attempt to prevent emotional pain through flawless performance. And then healing asks, can you tolerate being imperfect? The nervous system here is, can you tolerate being vulnerable to criticism again? No wonder letting go is difficult. People pleasing can become attachment insurance. So if abandonment's frightening, make yourself difficult to leave. Be useful, agreeable, available, helpful, low maintenance, forgiving, understanding. Never ask for too much. Anticipate everyone's needs, and somewhere underneath, if I make your life easier, maybe you'll keep me in it. And that's why simply telling someone stop people pleasing may not work. You're asking them to abandon a strategy that may have once felt like a protected connection. They first need to discover, can someone love me even when I'm inconvenient? And this is a much deeper healing task. Shopping, gaming, and social media can provide escape and reward. Different mechanisms, but similar functions. So for a little while, I don't have to be here. There's anticipation, there's novelty, there's dopamine, there's distraction, there's connection, or at least the feeling of connection, a different identity. So something to focus on besides the internal world. Again, the behavior isn't necessarily the fundamental issue. The question becomes, what becomes unbearable when this distraction disappears? And that's where the underlying grief may live. So pornography or
Woo! Hell yeah.
sexual behavior, not my bag, can become regulation too. And this deserves nuance rather than shame.
And to men, that's just nuance. There ain't no shame in that.
You said it. I didn't say it.
Man to man, they'll get it.
All right. Well, for some people, sexual stimulation or pornography may become a way of managing loneliness, anxiety, shame, stress, or emotional discomfort.
That's what happens that's why there's websites for men for all of that.
I suppose.
And if there was a workbook for that too, there'd be tons of men listening. For anxiety, shame, and stress, just for them.
Well, it can provide intensity without requiring the vulnerability of emotional intimacy.
Exactly.
So, if relationships have historically meant rejection, judgment, and abandonment or unpredictability, sexual stimulation can offer a form of relief that feels more controllable. That doesn't mean harmful or compulsive behaviors shouldn't be addressed. It means shame alone rarely explains or resolves why the behaviors became important. And sometimes the coping mechanism is another person. Not every coping mechanism is an object or a behavior. Sometimes a relationship becomes regulation. So, like one person's attention determines whether you're okay, their reassurance calms you, their distance destabilizes you, their approval makes you feel worthy, their rejection makes you feel worthless. So now you're not necessarily attached only to the person, you're attached to what their presence does to your internal state. And that can make an unhealthy relationship extraordinarily difficult to leave because losing them doesn't merely feel like losing a relationship. It can feel like losing your emotional regulator. And then healing says, give it up. And here's where your grief enters. Someone gets sober. They stop compulsively shopping. They stop binging. They set boundaries. They stop people pleasing. They leave the unhealthy relationship. They cut back on worth. Did I say worth? I meant work. They cut back on work. Stop chasing approval. And everyone says, this is wonderful. Maybe it is. But internally, then what do I do when I'm hurting?
Sex.
Maybe for some people.
For men. Emotionally.
Possibly. But because you've removed something, you haven't necessarily replaced it or its function yet. And that's why early change can feel so empty. So someone might think, I know this wasn't healthy, so why do I do this? Why do I miss it? Because unhealthy doesn't mean that it's emotionally meaningless, and that's an incredibly important distinction. You can grieve something that was hurting you. Okay, so we tend to believe that grief means I lost something good. Not always. People grieve abusive relationships. People grieve addiction. People grieve dysfunctional families. People grieve harmful patterns. People grieve identities that were destroying them. Why? Because grief isn't a moral evaluation of what was lost. It's a response to attachment and change. You can know this was hurting me and still feel I miss what it did for me. Both can be true.
What happens when you remove the coping mechanism? Before you've learned another way to cope,
you can feel incredibly exposed. The old strategy is gone, but the emotions that it managed, they're not. And that's why sustainable change can often involve building alternative supports and regulation skills rather than simply removing behavior. So the old coping mechanism no longer works for you, but the new skills don't feel natural yet. So you stopped escaping, but you haven't learned to tolerate the emotion. You stopped people pleasing, but you haven't learned to tolerate disapproval. You stopped drinking, but you still feel lonely. You left the unhealthy relationship, but you haven't learned to feel secure alone. You stopped working constantly, but now you don't know who you are without productivity. You stopped seeking everyone's approval, but you haven't developed your own internal validation. And that's an incredible, vulnerable space to be in. You've lost your old survival strategy before fully developing a new way to live, and this can feel like grief. And this is why shame based approaches can fail people. If someone says, "Why don't you just stop?" they're focusing on behavior. So, a more useful question is, what does this behavior do for you? Does it numb, soothe, distract, create control, create belonging, reduce loneliness? Does it provide validation? Does it help you sleep? Does it make you feel competent? Quiet, intrusive thoughts. Does it help you quiet the intrusive thoughts? That's a good one. Does it help you avoid vulnerability? Once you know the function, you begin asking what healthier ways you could eventually meet the same need, not merely how do I remove the behavior. And this is consequential grief again. So look at the chain: loss of safety, reliance on coping strategy, temporary relief, increasing dependence on strategy, consequences from the coping mechanism, additional losses, more grief, greater need for relief, stronger attachment to the coping mechanism. There's your cycle. For an example, I feel abandoned, so I drink. Drinking affects relationships. Relationships deteriorate. And now I feel more abandoned, so I drink more. Or I don't feel worthy, so I achieve. Achievement, it briefly creates worth. The feeling fades. I work harder. Relationships suffer because I'm always working. Now I'm lonely, so I work even more. Or I'm terrified that people will leave, so I people please. I never express my needs. Resentment, it seems to grow. Relationships become unhealthy. It ends, and I conclude, see, everybody leaves. And that's why coping mechanisms deserve compassion and accountability. They may have helped you survive, and they may also eventually create consequences. But again, two things can be true. And then there's the grief over what the coping mechanism cost. And this is another side. Once someone understands I did this because I was surviving, there may be relief from shame, but then comes the grief. How much time did I lose? How much money? Which relationship? Which opportunities? What did addiction cost me? What did perfectionism cost me? What did people pleasing cost me? What did working constantly cost me? What did avoiding intimacy cost me? What did numbing cost me? And this is where grief becomes incredibly powerful. So the original wound created a coping strategy. The coping strategy helped someone survive the wound. And then the coping strategy created new losses of its own. So now you're grieving both. Okay, so last time we went over, this time we're trying to keep time. So
Yep.
I think we've discussed a lot today. So we're going to go ahead and elect to carry on this conversation, and we will put that in the next episode. I really feel like this is valuable to your healing, so I hope that you will continue to listen to the next episode. I hope you guys have a great week. Is there anything you want to add?
Nope. Remember, man, I can only get better at time except playing COD.
All right, well, thank you for watching Unapologetically Reborn. This is where survival ends and choices begin.